Good morning, everybody. I think we're just waiting for our host to join, which is a bit unusual. So I shall say good morning and welcome. As per usual, we'll give it a few minutes just to wait for people to arrive and join. I can see that the numbers are steadily going up, so make sure you've got your brew. Can't function without my morning brew. Hey, there they are. I can't function without my morning brew. So I was just saying good morning, Laura, because you weren't here and there was tumbleweed going across the screen.
Sorry about that, Gemma.
Don't be daft. Don't you just love Wi-Fi and technology, everybody?
Absolutely.
I shall hand over to you gorgeous ladies and sit back in quietness.
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. We'll just hang on for a couple of minutes while a few more people come on. Okay, the numbers are going up, so thank you for joining us on this January day. Still January, somehow.
Still.
Nearly there, though. Okay, let's have a look. If anybody who's just joining us now, if you do have any questions for us this morning, by all means pop those into the box for us and we'll do our best to answer those today. I'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll introduce ourselves and then we'll get going with the questions. We've had a couple in advance, which is great for today. So we've got a few different things to talk about, but like I say, if you've got anything, any burning issues, then feel free to pop those in. Okay, so just while a few more people are joining, just to say who we've got on the panel today. Like I say, there's quite a few of us, which is great. So we've got myself and Kat, who are employment lawyers, dealing especially with schools and other education clients, academies and some colleges too. So we're here to answer any employment questions that you have. I'm joined by Stephen McArdle today, who's our litigation specialist. And we've also got Sam, who's our associate from our property team. We had Ridwan, who can answer anything in relation to insurance queries. And then we've got Gemma as well, who's our expert on many things in the education sector, academisation in particular, governance and data protection issues too. So I think we're going to start today actually with a question that I'm going to go to Stephen with. So we've had a question that's come in that says, we've discovered that people have been trespassing on school property at the boundary of the playing field. What steps should we take to prevent this? Okay, so I'll pass over to Stephen now.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Laura. Yeah, this sort of question does crop up from time to time, and it can be a real nuisance in terms of how it affects schools. What I found is that it sort of creates three main issues, I think, for schools. There's a security issue, obviously, with people who are not authorised to be on premises, wherever that might be, whether it's in the building or simply just on the site. It can create safeguarding issues, of course, which is of paramount importance to schools. But it can also create property issues, the squatters' rights, and other issues that can create problems for the actual integrity of the ownership of the site as well. One important thing, I think, as soon as you've identified that people have been either trying to get on the site or accessing the site for whatever reason, is trying to identify who those people are and obviously write to them and warn them off. It's very, very important that you're able to establish the boundaries of your site accurately. It should always be the case that at least a fence, some form of fence or system is in place to stop people from easily getting access. So if there's a part of the site that's, the fence is broken or whatever, then that needs to be repaired. You need to also understand if there are any rights of way over parts of the site, because they're very, very occasionally, especially with older schools, that can exist. So ensuring that you know where potential rights of way for third parties do exist and where they don't, and making sure that the part of your site that is and should be secure is secure. When it comes to people sort of accessing land that they don't own, if that happens over quite a long period of time and they've treated land as their own, then it is possible in some instances for people to apply to get rights to that land and actually apply to own parts of that land. So you get it sometimes when people perhaps extend their garden fence a little bit into a field or something like that. If that happens for over 10 years, if the land's registered, or 12 years, if it's not registered, then they can apply to the land registry and actually claim part of the land for themselves. So again, it's very important that in this instance, you keep an eye on that. You write to the people who are doing it, you tell them to stop, you warn them off, you take steps to secure your boundary if needs be. You can get a surveyor out to check certain boundary lines if it's not clear, or a property lawyer in terms of establishing what the deeds might say and making that a clearer issue for you to sort out. And aside from squatters' rights, you can get things like prescriptive rights, which are easements, which is rights of way, as opposed to actually just owning a piece of land. So again, if people are traipsing over part of a playing field because it's a cut through, and they do that for at least 20 years, continuous use, without asking for any sort of permission, or no one's actually challenged them about it, then they can actually again apply to the land registry for a formal right of way to be established. So again, that's something that's really important just to be aware of. The way to stop it is to tell people to stop it, put signs up saying it's private property, securing the boundary with fences and things like that. So yeah, it's a bit of a problem. I think people take liberties. People do it sometimes without realizing it. People who do it deliberately also probably cause property damage as well. And so one final remedy you can do, aside from just making sure your site is secure and people aren't coming onto it, is also take action against people to claim damages or compensation for property damage. I'm a school governor. I know budgets are very, very tight, and where you need to find extra money to put new fences up or to repair fields if they've been playing fields if they've been damaged, there isn't often a pot of money for that type of thing, or the contingency pot is very small. So it is worth taking action against people to get them to pay for it, if indeed you can identify who they are. And often people will, once threatened with court action for that, will offer to pay something. So that's probably what I would suggest in terms of that question.
Thank you. Quite a lot to think about there, isn't there? And
Yeah.
I know it would stray, litigation and property as well.
Yeah.
Sam, I know Stephen's given a very comprehensive answer, but if there's anything to add from your perspective on that, then feel free to let us know.
No, I think Stephen covered it. I think the important thing, as he said, is really establishing your boundary, making sure you know where your school site goes up to, how that interacts with neighbouring properties, and what the boundary features are that establish whose land ends where. And obviously, if you do, come across people that are encroaching, and we've had situations before where, during the school holidays, somebody redoes their garden and all of a sudden their fence has moved back a few feet, then it's establishing contact as quickly as possible to ensure that gets addressed. And if you need, like I say, a second opinion, then there are surveyors out there that can provide that service by looking at deeds and establishing where the boundary lines lie.
Great, thank you. We've actually had another question in which relates to, well, I suppose it's a facilities question. So Sam, I'll pass this one to you if that's okay. So the question that's come in is that our governors have asked what we ought to be doing to work towards and support the government's emissions and net zero targets, and if there's any support available to help us achieve those goals. It's obviously something quite topical, but yeah, I'll pass over to you, Sam. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that. It's something we get asked a lot about. Obviously, it is quite topical. I think the background to that is obviously the DFE and the targets they've set for reducing emissions production by education estates. What they want to achieve is a 3/4 reduction by 2037. And ultimately, what they're hoping for is for education providers to achieve net zero by 2050. The difficulty is working out how to go about doing that. And I think recent statistics estimates are showing that about 80% of existing education estates won't be able to hit net zero by the 2050 deadline. And I think the focus is largely because education estates across the UK public sector amount to 37% of public sector estates. and responsible for the building emissions. So there's clearly a lot of work that needs to be done. I think the recommendations largely lie around retrofitting, improving the energy efficiency of the older buildings that you've got on site, and also paying particular attention to any new buildings that you're looking to construct at the design phase, to make sure that they are designed and built in a sustainable manner. I think one of the easiest things that you can do as an estates manager is to look at your existing building, assess the EPC ratings and the expiry dates, and seek advice where you can as to how to make them more energy efficient. I think the thing we always try and kind of tell clients is that recommendation reports that are often annexed to EPCs are or tend to be automatically generated, so they don't always provide practical guidance. So the practical guidance they provide is often quite limited. But there are professionals out there that can provide reports on how you can go about improving energy efficiency in your estates. And of course, that can include upgrading insulation, moving away from fossil fuel heating systems towards more modern, low carbon alternatives, and looking at installing more economical electrical appliances where possible. But obviously that will need to be looked at on a case by case basis. However, obviously retrofitting, it's worth looking into. It can save costs, and also the added benefit is that it can avoid and reduce the embodied carbon that will come about from tearing down existing buildings and replacing them with new ones. We often get asked about solar panels as well, which is linked to this. Increasing number of schools are using solar panels to generate their own energy. Estimates, I think, are around about 30% of energy generated can often be wasted though during school holidays and at weekends. So there's a need where possible to look at installing batteries to store energy, which will help resolve this. But whilst they are becoming cheaper, it's another additional expense for schools on top of the cost of installing solar panels. And I think the issue is that there appears to be a lack of dedicated funding in this regard. I think schools are trying to do what they can to try and find the monies to put in these types of infrastructure. Larger trusts can often are lucky to be able to spend their own money and fund the necessary changes themselves. They can do this often from existing reserves or capital grants. It's not so easy for smaller trusts and schools. I think they're finding a struggle to do the same. But there are providers out there that will look at providing solar panels, and they'll do that for free. There'll be contracts where they'll look to install the solar panels for free and then allow the school to buy back the electricity that's generated at a lower than market rate fee. So there are options available in that regard. And I've come across as well one example in relation to solar panels where Kent Council, on behalf of their maintained schools, have purchased a solar farm to make cheaper, greener energy available to schools and to their other public buildings. So there are kind of initiatives out there, and there are organisations that are supporting schools with that. In terms of new buildings, the recommendation, I think, is always to kind of consider this at the earliest possible stage. Schools will want to construct new buildings and redevelop existing ones, and when they do, they should consider the environmental impact that has, both during the construction process and then also what impact it's going to have during the life cycle of that new building or that redeveloped building. And there are a number of voluntary schemes that schools can kind of sign up to that measure the environmental credentials of their buildings. The most widely used one is the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Methodology, which is BREEAM, and they provide a certification as well, which assesses, rates and certifies a building's environmental sustainability. So you may want to kind of aim for excellent or outstanding in relation to that in a bid to kind of reduce your energy performance. I think ultimately though, if you are looking at building new buildings, new construction projects, you're going to be led by any planning consents that are needed, and we're finding increasingly that these policies are being driven by environmental criteria. So there'll be all sorts of requirements regarding the development in terms of the materials that are being used, energy and waste consumption. Cycle storage provisions are often key to encourage or enable people to cycle to work and avoid using cars. Similarly with electric cars becoming more kind of widely owned, often there'll be need to put in EV charging points and that kind of thing. So you'll often find that your hands are tied, or you'll be kind of guided along, if you will, by what the planning requirements are. And obviously all of that will need to be factored in terms of your cost and your works schedule. But obviously none of that necessarily comes cheap, but there's always a cost involved, which kind of leads us on to the second part of the question, which is where support is available. I think there has been a massive push by the government, the new Labour government, towards improving education. Chancellor Rachel Reeves, as part of her first budget, announced an additional £4 billion for the sector, which included around £2.3 billion to be put into the core schools budget. I think it's hoped that that will allow for a number of planned projects to begin delivery this year, which I think is aimed primarily at tackling the deteriorating condition of some school and college buildings. But hopefully that will pave the way for a long-term strategy towards improving schools nationwide and their energy performance and sustainability. In the meantime, there's also the public sector decarbonisation scheme that was launched back in 2020. I think it's already provided around £2.5 billion worth of funding for over 1,000 public sector projects, many of which are school improvement projects. I think I read that in the region of about 34 academy trusts have shared £37 million. So there is money to be spent and to be gained in terms of tackling this particular issue. I think the focus on that has been towards looking at installing heat pumps, solar panels, insulation and that type of thing. I think the government's looking at moving that scheme forward across the next few years. I think phase 4 of the scheme is going to look at a more focused approach in terms of identifying the most or the projects which will bring about the most carbon emission savings. So nothing, I don't think, has been announced as to what that's going to focus on, but it's due to run from 2025 through to 2028. So I think the advice is just keep an eye on that and see whether there's any funding that can be applied for through that. And then I think finally the only other thing to add is that there is, particularly focused on the education sector, a new scheme that's being launched by Located, the government's property consultants, and they're looking at facilitating a rapid rollout of decarbonisation initiatives across education estates. It's currently in the consultation process, so no official guidance or decisions that have been published yet. But hopefully, given the DFE target dates and the fact that they are going to be fast approaching, I think this scheme is something that would benefit the sector, so is likely to gain a bit of traction over the next few years. But again, it's about keeping your eyes open as to what initiatives there are out there and how you can try and tap into those.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. There's obviously a lot to think about. It's really interesting, especially what you say about the energy loss during the holidays. I think it's something people don't necessarily think about, but it's obviously really important. But it's good to hear that there is potential funding out there for people and initiatives. So, you know, people should definitely be looking.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I've just noticed actually the numbers have gone up quite a bit since we started. So if anyone's joined a little bit late, welcome. Obviously, that's fine. And the session is being recorded. So if you have missed a couple of the first 1 or 2 questions or any of the information we passed on, then just let us know and we'll be able to get you the information over about what we've already talked about. And for anyone else who's joined, if you do have any questions, feel free to add those into the Q&A box. We've had one that's coming for you, Gemma. Very exciting. So the question for Gemma is about a conversion of a maintained school to an academy. And it says, to receive the 25,000 funding previously available for maintained schools to convert, and the application was in before the cut-off deadline, can one maintained school converting get this? We've been advised by the DfE it is 3 schools converting at the same time. So I'm hoping we'll be able to take that one. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Gemma.
That's joy for everybody if I'm on mute. Yeah, no problem at all. So yeah, unfortunately, as you're aware, and this does actually tie in with the new Children's and Wellbeing Bill that we're going to talk about shortly, Laura. A lot of funding has been either suspended or retracted or just stopped with regards to academisations. And the biggie was the help from the DfE that schools would receive to help with the conversion process to assist. So you could use it, for example, legal fees, surveys, and all towards your due diligence. Now, unfortunately, they have said that if you didn't get your application in, I think it was after the 2nd of December, then you can't apply for that grant. If you got it in before that date, then you should still be able to get it. And you should be able to get it for, I would say, each school. Now, I have had some arguments with the DfE. I'm very friendly with the DfE normally. We get on very, very well. But the issue that we have with this is that they are trying to be a bit tight at the moment. And I have successfully had some arguments with them over this, where they've sort of said, no, you're not eligible for that funding, or you can only get it for one school, or blah, blah, blah. And actually, you know, in my view, that's not fair, because they've given that deadline, they've given that cutoff date. So if you've got in before that, you are entitled to it. And I would say it is per school, i.e. per conversion. Now, they might try and argue if it's 3 schools coming together, it's going to be sort of one project, but it's not, because there's the creation of the MAT, which is in addition to a conversion. And then you've also still got to go through the process and do all the same documents for the 1, 2 or 3 schools, however many it is, that you would have to do anyway. So my point of view is, if you got your application in before that 2nd of December cutoff date and it was approved, then potentially you should be able to get that grant. I would just keep pushing and arguing with it, and you know, at the moment, and saying, if we've got this far down the track, you've approved it, you know, you're supportive of it, then please can you sort of look at this and come back to us, because financially we're not in a position to do it. And I will talk a little bit about this, as I say, later on with regards to the bill, and academies generally. But personally, my view is, if you got your application in before then, and I'm not sure, to be honest, if they're saying that it had to be approved by the regional director. I don't think it did. I'm pretty sure you had to just get your application in. I would say I'm 99.9% on that. So if you want any support and you want me to get on the phone to the DfE with you, please do let me know, because I do like a bit of bants with the DfE, and I'm quite happy to argue the point with them for you, because I have done it before. So my argument is, if you've done it before December, keep hammering them for it and tell them that you want the money.
Brilliant, thank you, Gemma. And yeah, as you mentioned, obviously that sort of strays into thinking about the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. So quite topical, and we have had a couple of questions on that. So one of the questions we specifically were asked is about the impact of that bill on the autonomy which academies currently have when it comes to teachers' pay and conditions. And is that correct, that there will be a significant impact? So I'm just going to pass over to Kat to take you through that one.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Good morning, everybody. So the Children and Wellbeing in Schools Bill is going through Parliament at the moment. So it is subject to change. So what we know at the moment is kind of what Labour proposed to do. But obviously, when you go through the parliamentary process, there's so many different stages. And we've seen previously, I think in previous Q&As, we've talked about how bills have significantly changed as they've gone through the parliamentary process. And the act that comes out at the end is very different to what was proposed initially. But, the Labour government have been very busy since they took power. We talked about the Employment Rights Bill, which is huge. And then we've got the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill as well. And there's some really quite far-reaching changes within this proposed bill. Just to let you know where it's up to. So it had its second reading in Parliament on the 8th of January. There was an oral evidence session on the 21st of January, and there's currently a call for evidence out. So it is making its way through the process, but the government are saying, look, we do want to hear what different bodies have got to say about this. So it's certainly not cut and dry, but at the moment, the bill proposes to change, I suppose, teachers' paying conditions in that they want to extend the application of the statutory paying conditions framework to academies. And also alternative provision academies as well. Now, it says in the bill that senior executive leaders of academies will be outside the scope of this, but it is quite a big change because previously academies obviously had this autonomy, and the Labour government are trying to roll that back a bit. Now, there is some objection to this already. I was having a look before we came in, and the Conservative former schools minister, Sir Nick Gibb, has said, look, this is he's described it as an act of vandalism. So he's not held back on his thoughts on this. And he said it potentially could be 20,000 teachers' pay cut, which is quite, a significant amount, really. So he's saying, they need to think about what they're doing. And they said that Labour's plans are going to water down academy freedoms, which the Conservative government said they're concerned about. So spend a lot of time on the parliamentary website. So I was having a quick look at the Education Select Committee that happened on 15th of January. And Bridget Phillipson was there, and she was asked about this and said, well, look, how is this going to work? Because you want people to be able to innovate. You want people to have autonomy. But if you're saying, well, actually, now the statutory paying conditions framework needs to be followed by academies, how is that going to work? So she said, I want to be absolutely clear that all schools will have full flexibility to innovate, with a floor and no ceiling on what that means. So a floor and no ceiling. So, it may be that they may kind of say, well, actually, yes, there is this framework, but if you want to pay more, you can do. But we're not sure kind of what that means yet. That's kind of what we're thinking. It might mean that there will still be some flexibility there, because I think she has acknowledged that there has been some concern raised about the changes that are proposed. So we'll see what this floor and no ceiling looks like. But that's one of the proposals at the moment. I think Laura's going to touch upon some other proposals within the bill. I mean, it's quite lengthy as well, and we have put an article out on this on our website as well. So if you want to have a read, you can do.
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, like Kat says, have a look at that for more details. And obviously, it can all be subject to change, but just to pick up on a couple of more things that the bill does refer to. One of them is about free breakfast clubs. And that's one of the standout features, really, because the bill is saying that there will be an introduction of free breakfast clubs for all primary school pupils across England. And they're saying that will have to be for a minimum of 30 minutes before the children start the school day. And that will obviously be from reception up to year 6. Now, it's a bit contradictory at the moment, because the bill on the one hand says there's a little bit of flexibility about how the schools can provide that, and they do actually say if they're struggling with staff resources and funding, they can outsource a service, and it doesn't have to be on site. But then in the guidance to the bill, it goes on to say that you don't want to hold a breakfast club in what they say is an unreasonable location that would inhibit the policy objectives, which is essentially making sure children have something to eat before they start the school day. So that kind of feels quite difficult. If a school is saying, well, actually, we want to outsource it somewhere else, they'd have to make sure that then that can be justified as reasonable. Obviously, funding is going to be a key issue here. And, that's something that the government are saying that they're promising to do. They've said in the budget there's an investment of 30 million for the 2025-26 financial year. And what that's going to be used for at the moment, and the first part of this process is that there's going to be a trial. So it's starting quite soon, actually. It's from April 25, so from that summer term. And there's 750 schools who are being classed as early adopters of this scheme. So it's a pilot programme, really, and how it works for those 750 schools will be fed back, and that will shape how it then is rolled out nationally for all schools. So it'll be interesting to see what the feedback is from those early adopters. And just to mention that there are already in place a number of schemes in relation to breakfast clubs. There's a national school breakfast programme, and the government has said that will continue to run while this early adopter scheme is also delivered. So for the period of time when the government's looking at how this can work, then the current schemes that are in place will continue. Another area in the bill that I think a few people have been quite interested is about uniform and branded uniform, because the bill includes provisions to limit the number of compulsory branded uniform items that a school can essentially say their pupils have to have during the school year. Now that's supposed to be 3, but for secondary schools who include wearing a tie, they're allowed 4. And it should be noted, though, that when they say for use during a school year, that it's expected that this would include items such as PE and sports equipment, and also school uniform is defined as any item or clothing or bag. So again, if the school has a branded, book bag or rucksack, it's likely that that would be one of the 3 or 4. So then you're not left with a huge amount left to play with, really. And they've said that a branded uniform item has a school logo or name on it, or as a result of its colour or design, is only available from a particular supplier. So obviously the aim behind that is to make getting the uniform more accessible for all pupils, from a cost perspective, as well as easily accessible in terms of having to go to one particular store as opposed to being able to buy it from, for example, from a supermarket. So that's something I think people will be keen to see how that develops. So yeah, there are just a couple of things I thought were quite interesting. So Gemma, if there's anything else you want to add on the bill, that'd be great.
Yeah, so since Labour came into power, there's been lots of questions bandied about with regards to academisation. What's going to happen with that? Is it still going to go ahead, etc., etc.? And there's all sorts of different opinions and views flying around. One view is basically Labour have got into power and gone, goodness gracious me, there's lots that we need to sort out here. We are just going to put a stop on everything, review it, see what the heck is going on, make an assessment, and then sort it out. That's one view. Another view is that they want to bring academisation to an end. Now, that kind of makes sense because there were ructions about this. I don't know, I mean, way back when they brought the Academies Act back in, dated 2010. There were ructions then about it. Labour didn't agree with it. They didn't want to bring it in. They weren't supportive of it. But we're in a situation now where we've got so far down the road and we've got that many academies, it's kind of well, we can't really do much else about it. However, in this bill, they are effectively, it does seem to be trying to take a bit of a row backwards and give a bit more power back to local authorities, which I know will not be music to people's ears, because a lot of the reasons that academisation came about in the first place was due to the fact that maintained schools were failing, they weren't getting enough support, etc., from their local authorities. And I think local authorities now are in a worse position than ever with regards to budgets and the situation that they're in and lack of resource. So a lot of people are kind of going, well, how is that going to work then? Because it didn't work before. And now all these years later, how is the local authority going to step up and get involved again? Now, I think it is about giving back more power to the local authority. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be that the local authority are going to go, great, we're going to take all the schools back over, we're going to run the show, and we're going to get involved because of those issues. So one of the main things with regards to academies is that the Secretary of State in the bill will now no longer actually be under a duty to make an academy order. regarding a school that's causing concern. So previously under the legislation, they were under a duty to produce that order, and now that has been taken away. So that's one of the big things. They don't have to do it, but just because they don't have to do it doesn't mean that they're not going to do it. I think we just need to sort of see how this will come about. And the aim is to give the Secretary of State a bit more flexibility, obviously. Now, they are saying that worst performing schools are still likely to go down the academisation route, which indicates that the academisation is still on the cards. But instead, it could end up going to, now, there's a snappily titled Regional Improvement for Standards Excellent Team. Excellent team, sorry, let me put my teeth in. So there's going to be the introduction of this new team who are going to make assessments, and I think they're going to sort of decide whether or not a school should academise. And obviously now we do have these strong academy trusts in place. It kind of makes sense that we would still use them, and if they are successful and they are working, why would we not? So, I mean, there's part of that. There is part 2 of the Act, which ends the legal presumption that new schools would become an academy. And it actually, instead of just making the assumption of, oh, right, they're not doing right, well, let's shove them down the academy route, they're actually going to give the local authority the power to invite proposals for other kinds of schools, such as foundations, VA schools, community schools. Now, again, that is about the local authority making recommendations and looking at the situation and inviting those proposals, and they will then feed that back as to what they think would be the best option. And again, that might not be that the local authority run it. It again could be a case of it should be an academy, or it should be this type of school, or it should be that kind of school. But the local authorities are going to be getting more involved in that, and they are going to be involved in the process if we do have failing schools. Local authorities will be able to make proposals themselves, so if they have concerns with regards to any schools. And there's a new Schedule 2, which is the procedure for determining those local authority, sorry, I say LA, it's a snappy lawyer talk, proposals. So it does seem a bit of a row back, but I'm not necessarily convinced it's a real step away from it. It kind of sits more with the, let's kind of see how we're sitting. Let's see how things are going. In the meantime, if we are having a bit of trouble, we've got this plan here that we can utilise to try and assist and support the school. However, academies' freedoms are going to be restricted because the plan is that all schools should be aimed to be on the same footing. And again, that kind of makes sense. However, I think it's just going to be on a case-by-case basis, and we're just going to have to see how that goes. It does also amend the Academies Act to introduce a requirement for academies to teach the national curriculum after there has been a revised national curriculum introduced. So again, that's just making it more like a level playing field and trying to make sure that all the children, whatever kind of school it is, are going to have that balanced playing field, and it is going to be consistent. So the focus seems to be about giving schools a chance. It's not writing academisation off completely, but it is, sort of rowing back a little bit. It is giving local authorities powers, but that isn't necessarily for them to run schools. It's more because you have to remember, they are still under statutory duties for the provision of education to children in their area. That duty still sits with them, whether it's an academy or it isn't. So their involvement anyway is going to be quite high, and it kind of makes sense that they are involved in that process. So I think that's probably all I wanted to point out at the time. There is going to, obviously, there's been sort of quite a lot of uproar about homeschooling and the fact that they're going to be tightening up the situation with homeschooling, which in my opinion is not a bad thing. I think that lots of children have got lost in the system. It's not monitored, it's not regulated properly. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Parents might disagree with me, but there we go. Most of the homeschooling parents I know are actually all for it and are quite happy with the situation and feel that it should happen because of those children that do fall by the wayside and parents just don't want to put them into school. And there is going to be a bit more of a clampdown on independent educational institutions. So it's going to catch all independent schools, and the wording that was used was to stop rogue institutions. So I thought that was quite interesting. And that means extending existing duties and protection to independent institutions. There will be heavy penalties if there is any breach of that, and there are going to be new powers for the Secretary of State. But again, I think it's all connecting back and tying back to that level playing field of trying to make sure every child has got the same opportunities and are learning the same sorts of things. There's lots of other things that are going on as well in that bill, but those are kind of the main ones I wanted to cover. And academisation seems to be the hot topic amongst most people. So we still don't quite know what's going to happen, but it does seem right, let's just take stock. And in the meantime, while we're taking stock, we're able to still do this. We're still able to academise. Local authorities perhaps can chip in, and we'll see how we go from there. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. Like you say, there's a lot to take on board, and we'll have to wait and see for a lot of it. And I think, you know, for some academies, it might not be as extensive changes as for others. I think it depends to the extent to which, for example, they already follow the national curriculum, or they already adopt standard teachers' pay and conditions, you know. But for some academies who are going their own way with things, it may well have a really significant impact. So we'll have to wait and see. But thank you, that was really helpful.
Forgot to say, actually, Laura, sorry, just quickly jumping in, that question before about the stopping of the funding. I've heard rumours about the reason behind that is with regards to it's seen as unfair that some of the larger mats that have a lot more money in them are still able to get that money, whereas sort of the smaller starter up mats and things like that, that don't have the reserves, they don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to afford it. And I think it's sort of connected in with that as well. So that's why I'm saying, you know, at the moment, don't give up, because I think it is being reviewed, but I think there are what they consider to be perhaps greedy mats that will try and get as much money out of the system as they can, when actually they could be bankrolling it themselves. So that just tied back into that grant situation. So yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, Ridwan, I'll come to you if that's okay, because we've had a couple of queries recently from our clients actually relating to school trips. So I just thought it'd be quite helpful to hear your thoughts. I think, you know, it's a time of year when schools are thinking about planning trips, or they already have done, you know, domestic or foreign trips. So do you have any thoughts about, you know, practical tips or measures that schools should be thinking about when they're coming to school trips?
Yeah. Good morning, all. Trips, it's certainly health and safety area, HSE area. It is a minefield. I probably could speak for an hour, to be honest, from certainly cases I've been involved in. I'll touch upon a couple of those in terms of the takeaways, but certainly in terms of school trips, I have to say from the outset, they are a really important part and parcel of a child's education. The government recognise that, the HSE recognise that. You can't take away, you know, school trips come with its obvious risks, but it's all about balancing those risks and taking appropriate measures, as you say. What the HSE say in terms of their guidance, they say any measures have to be proportionate, and you can't concentrate on paperwork too much. But I'll come on to the paperwork issue in a minute. School trips are essentially categorized into, you can have routine trips, going to a cinema, going to Blackpool, going to the ice rink, for example, or you could have more sophisticated trips, i.e. Trips within the UK, educational trips involving overnight stays, or even including foreign trips, and those are a bit more complicated. And I've got a couple of examples which I'll come on to later on. But essentially, the takeaway in terms of the planning process is it has to be proportionate. It has to approach planning and organising those trips having regard to the type of trip that's been organised. So it's all about, you know, if you're going to Blackpool Pleasure Beach, are you going to have a Gemma? I know, but if you're going to Blackpool Pleasure Beach,
you need a risk assessment on your own going to Blackpool, Ridwan. Yeah, I live there.
There's obviously going to be some hazards and some measures that you're going to obviously have in place, such as identifying the children, making sure they don't get lost, the supervision aspects of things, slips and trips potentially, if they are joining rides, that type of thing. It then becomes a bit more sophisticated if you're organising getaway travel. So the key message regarding, the approach is identify real risks. That's for certain. What does real risks mean in insurance speak? We're talking about what they call foreseeable risks. So the duty of care on on schools is to take reasonable care for the children within their custody. Whoever's supervising, and they're generally teachers, they will essentially have locus parenti. So they have the same duty of care towards the children as they would as a parent towards their children. The duty is not an absolute duty, it's a duty of reasonable care. So planning is certain, but one thing I say, and it's something that I've advised recently following an inquiry from you, Laura, is if, for example, you're traveling away to a foreign country, understand the foreign rules as well. So there may well be different entry requirements. As an example, we're outside, obviously Brexit has happened, we're outside the EU. Even if you're traveling to a EU country, they may well have still special requirements, entry requirements, requiring children to have an authorization letter from their parents, signed, sworn by a solicitor or evidenced by a solicitor. And so you have to go through that process. You really need to have a look at the actual government website in terms of the country you're traveling to, ensuring that you're actually complying with the entry requirements for that particular country. That is really important. You can't, long gone the days where you rock up to the airport with 25 children, show their passports, thinking that you're going to get through customs. It's just, it's just not going to happen. They may, that cut the holiday short at that stage. It really needs proper planning in that process. Obviously, before that, the education part comes about parental consent. Teachers normally, if you've schools have organised trips, they probably will already have that. But in the run up to a trip, probably 4 to 6 weeks before a trip, having a parents' evening or parents' education meeting with those parents of the children attending is really important. Setting out the ground rules in terms of the itinerary, what's expected of the children, what's expected of the parents as well in terms of emergency numbers, contact numbers, things in terms of children's specific needs for the children's, whether that's allergy related or otherwise as well. So there's a lot of factors that have to be taken into account. Other more practical measures, and again, schools are generally really, really good at this, but insurance arrangements, making sure your insurers are aware that you're taking that you're covered first and foremost, that don't assume, inquire if you're not even sure about it. It's worthwhile just making an inquiry. We're going out on a foreign school trip. Are we covered? You need to make sure that you are. Staff ratios and the level of supervision is really, really important because, again, from experience, and I'll give you an example later on, what we may deem to be an acceptable ratio in terms of supervision, whether that's 1 to 15 or 1 to 10, may not actually be an applicable, appropriate, reasonable ratio in whichever country you're traveling to. So it's important to understand the local rules of the country you're traveling to as well. It's really important. And that's where actually an EVC may come into may be helpful, a education visits coordinator. So they normally scope the trip, look at those risk factors, look at that information and be able to provide it. Certainly in terms of the teachers traveling, ensuring they are trained. They're not just going on the jolly, and most of them are properly trained by schools, have proper training, understand the risk assessments, but knowing what to do in an emergency is important as well. So actually just running through those scenarios is an important factor. Having an information pack with the teachers is an important factor. Having the up-to-date emergency numbers. So I've covered off staff ratio. Certainly during the course of the trips, supervision, it goes without saying, the level of supervision has to be there. It has to be proportionate, but it really depends on the age of your children as well, in terms of, and the nature of the activity as well. So there's a lot of, there's various factors that may apply. And I'll give one example. Water, certainly a lot of school trips may involve outdoor activities involving water sports, for example, where teachers in their own right, they're not going to be experts in undertaking that. You may well have an organizer for that particular activity, taking, supervising that particular trip, but it's setting the ground rules in relation to that, which is important. Certainly going off in terms of the risk, certainly risk assessments are key to all this process, setting out, and that's where the EVC comes into play, knowing your itinerary, ensuring that the itinerary and the activities that are taking place are risk assessed. If they are going off script, and there's no right and wrong answer, but they should really stick to the itinerary. If they do go off script and think, actually, is there an activity that the children want to undertake which is not within the itinerary, they need to really undertake a dynamic, even a written risk assessment at that place, and ensure measures are in place. And the reason I say that, I was recently involved, it's a really tragic case actually. It's been going on and it's still going on. Unfortunately, an incident, believe it or not, happened over 10 years ago. It was a foreign school trip. A UK school took a group of children to a EU country, and a school child fatally died on that school trip from a drowning incident. The activity being undertaken was a water sport based activity. There was a lifeguard in the lake that the children were allowed to swim in. It wasn't a prescribed activity, i.e. it wasn't on their itinerary, but there was some period of time between one activity finishing and when they were being taken back to the hostel, and the supervising teachers deemed it was appropriate for the children to go and swim in this lake that was supervised. It was delineated, it had a lifeguard there. They did carry out a risk assessment. It was supervised, but sadly this girl, a young child, still drowned during that incident. And I say it's tragic because that incident actually proceeded with a prosecution against the teachers. I'm pleased to say they were acquitted of the manslaughter charges that they were faced. We represented the lead teacher in that prosecution in the foreign jurisdiction. But it's important that those when you look at the questions that they were asked during the course of the trial, they're asked about the risk assessments, they're asked about the level, their training, their level of supervision, the level of planning. Those factors are really, really key. The actual, certainly that case, they had to put the teachers, and they did a great job about it, they had to put in the emergency plans in place. So having that in place are really, really key. Clearly, a tragic incident, you know, fortunately, they're very few and far between, but they do happen. And obviously, one of the aspects and one of the learning points about that was, certainly in today's age, is social media, children with mobile phones, having the message out there. So whoever they're sending, obviously notifying the head teacher or the deputy head, getting that message out from the head teacher to the parents of the children is really important. What they did do, and I think was rightly done in my view, was they did take the mobile phones off the children at the time in order for the wrong message not to be sent out. So it has to be a consistent message, especially at that stage when an investigation is taking place, at that early stage. But certainly, I know it's a bit of a grim, a tragic incident, but there's certainly lots of lessons to learn from that. Other aspects to bear in mind certainly is procedures, health and safety procedures. They apply whether you're taking a child within the UK or to a foreign jurisdiction. There have been instances, and some people may ask, well, what about the involvement of the health and safety executive if, for example, there's a serious incident which is reportable to the health and safety executive under the RIDDOR reportable procedures? Is there a possibility that a school may be prosecuted? If it's a foreign incident, then the HSE don't have jurisdiction. However, if it's an incident within the UK, the HSE do have jurisdiction. That's not to say there may well be other sort of parallel proceedings anyway, whether that's certainly civil or criminal proceedings. Certainly, as I've sort of indicated with the other example, there's a civil claim in the foreign jurisdiction as well as a criminal case in the foreign jurisdiction. And there's an ongoing pending inquest here in the UK as well. So certainly an inquest would be held if it involves a fatality. And in terms of, I've covered off emergency procedures, really, really important. Activities involving high risk, having those risks assessed. You know, your general risk assessment is probably not going to work. It really needs to be activity-focused risk assessment. The risk assessments have to look at what measures are in place and how you minimize the risk factors. That may well be having, for example, if the example, water sports, having the lifeguard there, ensuring children can swim, they're competent. If children don't want to swim or go into water, they're not forced to do so. They're, they can sit out an activity. So those types of measures certainly have to be in place. So I think I've kind of touched upon a lot of, kind of given an overview of a lot of the factors. I know there's a lot to take in there, but happy to take any questions should anything arise from that subsequently.
Thanks so much, Ridwan. Like you say, there's so much to think about. Really interesting. But yeah, if anyone has any follow-up questions, let us know. I know from my experience as a crossover with trips and potential employee issues, I've been advising a client who, has had to take employees through a disciplinary process in relation to something that happened on a foreign trip. And the issue is, to what extent were those teachers responsible? Had they got the correct procedures in place? Had they followed the right risk assessment? Was the supervision reasonable? you know, and that's just from the internal perspective of, do the employees need to be taken through a disciplinary process, which could potentially end in termination of their employment. So there's a lot to think about with those things.
Laura, can I just add at this stage, the support for the teacher, certainly in a serious incident, is really, really important from the school.
Yeah.
And I can't stress that enough, because yes, there's, you know, serious incident, there's always a family at the center of the investigation, but equally we have other parties as well. So certainly the support for other children as well as the teachers is really, really key. And I'm pleased to say, certainly the cases I've been involved in, they've had supporting employers as well. So that's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important factor. You know, if an employer is thinking, is this a misconduct issue, then they need to take that into account and, you know, decide, is it something that actually requires their support more than it does a disciplinary process. So it's a case-by-case basis, but lots to think about. Okay, well, that brings us to the hour. So thank you so much for everyone for attending. I think it's been a really great session this morning. Lots covered. And the next one, if you could join us, is the 27th of Feb, I believe. So we'll be back then to answer any questions that you have. If you have anything, send them across to us. Bit of a spoiler alert, I think we'll look at neonatal leave and pay from an employment perspective, because that's a change on the horizon. But any other topics that you want us to cover, do let us know. And thanks again for joining us today. Okay, hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks to all the participants. Thanks.
Bye.